Somewhere in the Palestinian occupied territories, in the dead of night, treasure hunters are at work. Armed with metal detectors, these looters are searching for relics from the past. Their work is illegal, yet potentially there's a rich reward. Since 1967, countless artifacts have been unearthed and removed from the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The most significant treasures were taken not by freelance raiders, such as these men, but by state-sanctioned archaeologists. Many of the treasures are on display in museums and private collections. Control of the land's cultural legacy is an added point of controversy between Palestinians and Israelis, one that strikes at the very heart of identity and ownership in the Holy Land. Part of the conflict over cultural heritage centers on this ancient city, Jericho, in the occupied West Bank. Over the centuries, many civilizations built monuments and shrines here. It's a special place for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Today, Jericho is Palestinian-ruled territory.
Jericho has been inhabited continuously for 10,000 years, and that makes it one of the oldest cities in the world. By marking 10,000 years of Jericho's history and heritage, we are sending a message. This is our city, a Palestinian city. We are celebrating our heritage in this illustrious place. We are proud caretakers of this district, and we invite the world to join us in commemorating our cultural heritage.
But only a small portion of this heritage remains in Palestinian hands. Jericho's most spectacular antiquities, such as these 7th century Umayyad dynasty statues, unique in Islamic art for their depiction of the human form, are housed in this Jerusalem museum. The building, formerly known as the Palestine Archaeological Museum, was built in the 1930s to house Palestine's archaeological treasures. The museum was seized by Israel in 1967 during the Six-Day War and renamed the Rockefeller Museum. Palestinians are demanding the museum and its treasures be returned, and they claim international law is on their side.
When Israel comes onto the scene as an occupying power in 1967, they have additional obligations as they've committed to under the 1954 Hague Convention. And those obligations require them to ensure that those artifacts are returned to the territory in which it is occupied. So those artifacts have to be returned, must be returned to the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
Many artifacts in the museum come from the Jericho site called Hisham's Palace, named after an 8th century Islamic ruler. There are plans to designate the palace as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Scholars regard Hisham's Palace, known in Arabic as Khirbet al-Mafja, with great significance.
So Khirbet al-Mafjar, among a few other buildings like the Dome of the Rock, the Aqsa Mosque, the Great Mosque of Damascus, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, these monuments set the tone for the development and emergence of Islamic art. For that reason, Khirbet al-Mafjar artifacts are important for tracing the beginnings and emergence of Islamic art.
Using 3D computer graphics, the Palestinian Department of Antiquities recreated what Hisham's Palace once looked like. However, hardly any of the statues and frescoes, which make Hisham's palace unique in the history of Islam, remain in Palestinian hands.
So that is why it is important for us to have access to these artifacts and finds. And in fact, this is part of our demand that the museum will be returned to Palestinian hands.
The contents of Hisham's palace constitute a fraction of the artifacts taken from the West Bank and Gaza.
The Palestinian territory is considered one of the most looted in the world. In the late 1980s and early 90s, more than 100,000 pieces were stolen every year by Israeli teams of archaeologists under the guise of rescue excavations. Untold numbers of sites were destroyed and their cultural heritage value negated.
But Israeli archaeologists regard these excavations as not only legal, but also necessary for historic preservation.
Let's leave aside hundreds of sites that are excavated as part of infrastructure development, which is just run-of-the-mill. I would say that even under the most stringent rules of the Geneva or Hague Conventions, infrastructure excavations have to be carried out. Someone has to do them.
Many Israelis believe they have greater rights to the land, since Jewish presence there predates the arrival of Islam. Greenberg argues that it is pointless to talk of dividing the land in terms of cultural heritage.
The West Bank and Israel are a single archaeological landscape. The green line, this assumed political division between Israel and Palestine, is a completely artificial line in historical terms. So that anyone doing archaeological work, that study is going to include sites in Israel and in the West Bank. And as soon as the West Bank was opened up to Israeli researchers, they didn't see any barrier to the inclusion of sites in the West Bank in their database, in their sphere of interest. And in fact, they saw themselves as protecting some of these sites, at least some of them did.
Of all the ancient relics found in the West Bank, the most famous are the Dead Sea Scrolls, now housed at the Israel Museum. Today, Palestinians insist they are the legitimate owners.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the more prominent examples of artifacts found in the occupied Palestinian territory. They were discovered in 1947 by a Palestinian shepherd, Muhammad al-Deeb. Those artifacts have been preserved and restored and housed and exhibited at the Palestine Archaeological Museum, of course, until 1967, when the Israeli authorities occupied the West Bank. Shortly thereafter, the Israeli authorities, although they are signatories to the 1954 Hague Convention, removed the artifacts from the Palestinian Archaeological Museum in clear contravention of their obligations.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a major tourist attraction, which highlights how the dispute over archaeology is not just political, but also economic.
Tourism in Palestine is a major pillar of our economy. We don't have oil or other natural resources. And major employment sectors, including services and handicraft production, are all linked to our tourism economy.
It's not only the Palestinians who believe tourism could fuel the economy of a future Palestinian state.
The truth is that the Palestinian territory is an absolute goldmine for tourism, really. I mean, it's probably got some of the greatest sites in the whole of the world.
In September 2010, Special Envoy to the Middle East, Tony Blair, visited the West Bank.
You know, these are amazing places for people to come to. So one of the things we're trying to do is to work out a plan where, as the Palestinians take back control of their own territory, we develop these sites and turn them into something for the Palestinian people, but also for tourists from outside.
A few weeks before Blair's visit, a new round of direct negotiations was launched between Israelis and Palestinians. From an archaeological perspective, there is skepticism on both sides.
There is a talk that the Israelis are trying to keep certain items that they are important for their historical or national interests. Among these are the Dead Sea Scrolls, saying that these are more important to Israelis than to Palestinians. So we need to be vigilant that Israel will not exclude many of these items of returning them to the Palestinians.
Members of Israel's archaeological establishment acknowledge that Israel is uncomfortable with the prospect of returning land or artifacts.
So when they start to speak about a peace process and they think that areas will be given to Palestinians, the Antiquities Authority makes what it's called an operation. It's called to rush and to make a large survey in the Dead Sea area to find now more scrolls, if they are there. Why not leave it? Because they don't want to leave it for the Palestinians if there is a Palestinian state. But what's so wrong that the Palestinian would find a scroll?
There are many contentious issues at stake in negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. But no subject seems as intractable as sovereignty over Jerusalem. Control over the city's holy sites, its antiquities, and even its history remains as explosive as ever.
Welcome to Israel. Welcome to Jerusalem, to the Western Wall and to the Western Wall tunnels. But what is the Western Wall? Where did it all start? How did it all begin? In order to answer those questions, we have to go way back in history, about 6,000 years.
Each year, hundreds of thousands of visitors flock to Jerusalem. Many are shepherded around by Israeli tour guides, giving an Israeli version of history.
When God created the world according to the Jewish tradition, he put down a foundation stone right here. This mountain did not yet exist, but from this foundation stone, this mountain grew. This is Temple Mount.
As tourists walk through the underground tunnel, quite literally above them, Palestinians pray in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Muslims regard this mosque as one of the holiest places in Islam. It is one of the most contested religious sites in the world.
We've been digging for over 43 years now, ever since 1967. So right now, we don't see anything outside. We don't see the Western Wall outside, except for right over here, the Western Wall Plaza and the Southern Wall excavations, the Davidson Center. And we're standing right underneath the Muslim Quarter.
Archaeology and the claims of cultural heritage are powerful factors fueling the ongoing Arab-Israeli dispute. Nowhere is this more evident than in Jerusalem.
أصبح واضحاً بأن التنقيبات الأثرية الإسرائيلية في القدس هي
It is clear that the Israeli excavations in Jerusalem are ideologically driven in an attempt to rewrite the history of Jerusalem in line with the plans and the policies of Jewish settler movements in the city.
بما ينسجم ويخدم المخططات والسياسات
It is an aberration of science married to an ideological movement. Even some Israeli archaeologists admit that it is a bloodthirsty approach.
وكما أشير لها من قبل بعض الأثريين الإسرائيليين أنفسهم تمثل نموذجاً دموياً.
Israeli archaeologist Rafi Greenberg believes that Jewish religious authorities use religious sites to reinforce their ideology.
So you have this special situation, for example, on the Western Wall tunnels, which are controlled by the rabbinate, by the religious authorities of the Western Wall. And they want those excavations to actually support a certain narrative of what the Western Wall means. And insofar as it supports the narrative, they're very supportive. And when it's kind of off to one side, they get a little bit uncomfortable, and and it's very difficult to work with the religious authorities on archaeological evidence. It doesn't really; these things don't really mix at all.
Away from the tensions of the Middle East is the more relaxed setting of the Danish capital Copenhagen. Bible scholar and archaeologist Thomas Thompson argues that biblical accounts of Israel's history are at odds with archaeological evidence. According to Thompson, David Ben-Gurion, a founding father of the Israeli state, saw archaeology as a state-building tool.
Ben-Gurion developed a small roundtable of scholars which met every week to discuss the Bible, to discuss history, to discuss questions of roots, relationship of Jews to Palestine. And I think the primary issue, beginning with Ben-Gurion in his roundtable, was specifically the question of making both land and the people of their belonging to the land. And when you have the vast majority of the people coming in after 1948, the question of indigenous is a tremendously complex one, and something that has to be created. And it has to be created by scholarship and by authors.
Israeli professor Raz Kletter is ambivalent about whether the early Zionist leaders politicized archaeology.
It's true and it's not true. I mean, there is, of course, what we say that the early Israeli archaeology was nationalistic, and it's typical of every state in this stage of development. So it is true. However, there is no general master plan that from the beginning says we will excavate only Jewish remains and destroy all the others. It's not like that. And I think naturally we should not forget that people also are interested in their own culture. So they are mainly excavating, they go to excavate Masada. It's not a sin, it's because this is what was of most interest to them. And then the regime uses this, of course. Gradually they understand that they can use archaeology and develop it as part of the ideology of Zionism.
And it was this ideology of Zionism which, according to many observers, contributed towards the eviction of Palestinians from their land.
When the state was established on a large part of Palestinian territory, there were some 800,000 people who were moved within about a year to a year and a half. And they could be moved and be seen by most of the rest of the world as intruders. After 48, the Palestinians were systematically removed and given Jewish names. It was that successful.
What's in a name is an important issue, as can be seen in the Palestinian village of Silwan, just outside Jerusalem's city walls. In the village, Jewish settlers have built an archaeological park, which they call the City of David. Jonathan Mizrahi is an archaeologist and former employee of the Israel Antiquities Authority. These days, he gives alternative tours to speak out against the growing politicization of archaeology.
You come in here, you enter in here, and you hardly see any Palestinian in your tour, actually. You went to City of David, and I don't know if you came from the old city, but if you come from the old city, you easily can come to the visitor center. Your tour is very much isolated from the village. And then obviously, you hear the Israeli narrative, you know how it's important to you, you didn't see Palestinians, and the full picture is prepared for you. Okay? Questions?
Mizrahi's audience on this tour is a group of Danish students.
First of all, I think we are in the heart, almost kind of in the heart of the conflict. We are in the East Jerusalem, Temple Mount, Silwan. It's definitely the area of the heart of the conflict. Archaeology, I think, is a very important tool that's been used to legitimize settlement in East Jerusalem.
Silwan is home to some 40,000 Palestinians, but a number of militant Jewish settlers have moved into Silwan to claim their village for Israel.
And this is why I think today the government invests so much money in tourism by coming and saying the past must be in our hands, because how can we give up our heritage? I mean, this is the meaning of our belonging here. This is the sign, it says City of David. What people don't know, this is also the sign of the settlers organization. They're not aware to the political problematic of this place. The Palestinians, like people mentioned, feel that been taken from them, and a big part that they feel the archaeology took from them. And then archaeology actually, unfortunately, becomes the enemy here.
Unlike the Israelis, the Palestinians have not used archaeology to shape their national identity.
Palestinians in general saw archaeology and the archaeological sites as part and parcel of the Israeli occupation or the Israeli institution.
Most tourists visiting places such as Jerusalem and Bethlehem do so on Israeli tour buses with Israeli guides. They rarely meet any Palestinians.
Now, the reason why Palestinians are not as interested in archaeology as Israelis, because they don't have to prove that we were here 2,000 years ago. So there is no attempt by Palestinians, and I think to a certain extent by Palestinian institutions, to try to use archaeology as a nation-building tool.
Jerusalem is said to be the most fought-over city in the world. Warring nations and cultures have battled to dominate it for thousands of years. The struggle is very much alive today.
There's changing agendas, and we might call these facts on the ground that are changing. You have the West Bank, and we have a discussion of peace talks to give the West Bank back to the Palestinians, and this goes hand in hand with new settlements and hundreds of thousands of settlers that are coming into this land. And the question of toponymy, the question of archaeology, is one of the ways that this battle can be fought when you're working on two different political fronts at the same time. One is the international scene of seeking peace, and the other one is to establish Israel's indigenous right to the West Bank in Gaza.
Since Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, countless artifacts have been removed from the occupied Palestinian territories. Some of the region's most remarkable historic treasures were taken from Gaza.
This is probably a grave here. See how you can tell? The earth is soft. In 1967, the Israelis occupied our whole world. We had access to the West Bank then, and we thought that was a good thing. We were delusional.
Gaza has changed a great deal since its conquest by Israel in 1967. But the memory of Israel's 38-year-long occupation is still fresh. Samir Abu Salim has lived all his life in Deir al-Balah, a town in central Gaza. He remembers the day when a prominent Israeli military commander came to see his father, the town mayor.
The first person to search for antiquities was Dayan. He came and said, "I want to meet the Sheikh Abu Salim." That was my father.
Abu Salim remembers the honeyed words of the Israeli general.
He said, "We want to live in peace. We don't want Egyptian rule. We don't want Jordanian rule. We are cousins. And we want to live together," and so on and so forth. It was all lies. It was all lies. They wanted any proof. They wanted to find Hebrew antiquities.
General Moshe Dayan was an Israeli national hero, a victorious military commander who served as Israel's defense minister and foreign minister.
People in Israel still have a common view of him as a hero who is, fighting the bureaucracy and saving antiquities. This is not the truth. The man robbed and he ruined. He destroyed sites. He did awful things. When he became the Ministry of Defense, he has the huge army at his disposal. And it's like a private kingdom of his. So soldiers started to speak about it. And there are scandals, but the matter is hushed. So it gets to the Knesset and parliament members attack him. But he is immune. He is a Knesset member, he is a big boss. And of course he lies about it, or it's not that he lies, he tells half-truths. So he tells, "I didn't steal for myself, it's for an Israeli museum." But it's not exactly true. And he has collaborators among the archaeologists who run with him, and they get something in return.
Among the most important finds that Dayan looted from Gaza were anthropoid clay coffins like these. Over 3,000 years old, such artifacts are unique to the Canaanite and Pharaonic civilizations, which dominated the region at that time.
What happened in the Gaza Strip, in a site of an Egyptian, let's say local Egyptian cemetery. And what happens is that a local Palestinian finds it and begins to rob it. Dayan hears about it. So he arrives to the scene and he collaborates with the Gazan person, and together they rob it. He pays something to the person and he gets the antiquities.
On a dirt road in Deir al-Balah, the son of one of the Palestinian tomb robbers who cooperated with Dayan remembers the Israeli general.
Dayan was at his peak, a victorious man. He had just defeated the Arabs. Abdel Nasser, Tlas, King Hussein. He was spreading his muscles and he was arrogant.
Abu Hamad remembers being beside his father in 1967 when Dayan arrived on the scene.
Stop. What are you doing? Why do you ask? You took Palestine already. Why do you have to follow us here? Now you want Gaza and Sinai? No, no. I just want some of your pottery shards. He was poking fun at us. He thought we are fools. I want those shards, or I'll put you in prison. So what? My natural state is imprisonment. You know, there are antiquities thieves, and we were among them. We didn't understand at the time that we were stealing. I swear, we didn't realize.
At the time, Abu Hamad was a boy of 13, but it's only now, 4 decades later, that he grasps the enormity of those events.
ديان كان يعرف ما معنى التابوت. إيش معنى الآثار الفرعونية؟
Diane knew the value of these coffins because he knew history. We were ignorant. They didn't want us to learn. But we learned in spite of them. When we would find something, my father would say, "Call that fool Diane." But in reality, we were the fools.
كنا احنا الهبل احنا الأغبياء.
Abu Hamad rejects the suggestion that his father was a collaborator.
We know who brought the Israelis. I resent the accusation we brought them. I refute that accusation.
Dayan had an insatiable desire for antiquities. His collection found its way into Israeli and foreign museums. On his death, Dayan left his private collection to his second wife Rachel, who sold it in 1986 to the Israel Museum for $1 million.
He was the Minister of Defense. He was the highest-ranking military leader in the land. He ordered his generals to bring him any artifact they found. When the military was about to release a prisoner, or when anyone applied for a permit, they would say to you, "Go, get me some antiquities."
According to Israeli experts, Dayan's role overseeing the removal of Palestinian antiquities went far beyond Gaza.
I think also we have the tip of the iceberg, because when he was the boss over the West Bank and Gaza, this is probably the time that he did the worst looting. He used bulldozers, he used helicopters, he had lots of... So for example, there are rumors, but I think they are true, that he arranges a military training. So he arranges it to be at a certain antiquities site, so the soldiers dig there, and if something is found, he can take it. The Antiquities Department tried to fight against it. Of course, they were politically weak, they didn't have the force. Dayan was much stronger and was backed by the government, so they always found solution not to talk about them, so he could do it for many years.
When the Dayan collection was finally put on display at the Israel Museum following his death, the title of the exhibit was as controversial as the general himself.
The worst part of the story is that they make an exhibition, Man and His Land. And I say that it's not man and his land, it is a man robs his land.
But Palestinians feel it was their land that Dayan robbed.
Thousands of pieces were taken away in boxes and put in helicopters. In Rafah, sometimes 2 helicopters a day would take off.
كان في اليوم الطيارة الهليكوبتر مرتين تشيل.
Older and wiser, Abu Salim today understands the value of cultural heritage.
I dream of the day when I have a state and a museum. Because a people without antiquities are a people without roots. A people without a culture and traditions are people who do not exist.
Across the land historically known as Palestine, archaeological finds stretch back to the dawn of human history. Morag Kersel is a respected Canadian archaeologist and a specialist on the subject of antiquities looting in Palestine.
You know, that's like a precursor to the trade in antiquities, was the trade in relics that was sanctioned by many of the churches in the area. And it's, you know, it finds its origins in the relic, you know, from Helena and Constantine, you know, and it finds itself in the relic gathering. There have always been people meeting that demand.
Kersel's research focuses on antiquities looting in the occupied Palestinian territories over the past 40 years.
Cultural heritage is really at the forefront of many states' political consciousness. In the 1990s and the late 90s, after Oslo, the Palestinians actually passed like an ordinance or something where they made it illegal, because they had a problem with looting and they recognized it, and they were working with the Israelis to protect the borders. And so they passed something like a local legislation to say it was illegal. Most people who loot are what's commonly referred to as subsistence looters, so people who loot to feed their families. There were also some people who were looting almost as an act of resistance.
These are all taken from tombs, never from homes, only from tombs.
These Palestinian grave robbers work only at night. They sell their finds to middlemen who locate Israeli buyers. They allowed us to film them, as long as we did not show their faces.
This is a Samaritan, not an Islamic oil lamp. It's the same idea. Oil went in here, and here are the burn marks. You can still see them. This is from the Islamic era. We get them from the Sebastia area. It was inhabited through the ages by many civilizations. It's not like the Israelis claim that the land is only theirs. Reality is different.
The robbers are self-taught experts on the origins and potential value of their finds.
We find artifacts and we sell them to traders, who buy them and then sell them to the Israelis. Greek, Iron Age, Byzantine pieces, they each have their price. There are pieces that are in special demand. The most expensive ones are mostly Jewish pieces. The Israelis want these pieces to prove that the land belongs to them. There are all the ones, the Canaanite pieces, and of course the Islamic pieces, but no one buys them, because no one wants to recognize that we were here. So they don't buy them or exhibit them, and they don't even talk about them.
For archaeologists, looting renders even the most impressive pieces practically worthless.
When we excavate, it is of ever-increasing importance to have the finds in their proper context. I have to find those things in their proper location. It doesn't help me to find the cooking pot in a shop, even if it's a wonderful Bronze Age cooking pot with the remains of a meal in it. because I have no idea where it was in the house. So the story I want to tell about that Bronze Age house is entirely dependent on my discovering everything in its place.
Many archaeologists believe Israeli laws concerning the sale of antiquities are contradictory and seemingly illogical.
There's an anomaly in the Israel antiquities law. Before 1978, it was legal to sell antiquities. After 1978, it remained legal to sell antiquities, but not to obtain them.
With thousands of items sold annually to tourists, the antiquity traders must be getting their wares from someone.
It's an open secret that most of the artifacts have been looted after 1978 in Israel and in the West Bank. And it is impossible for the authorities to actually provenance the finds and prove that they are looted artifacts. Only rarely do they catch the looters in flagrante.
With political and military issues dominating the agenda, few are surprised that the Israeli or Palestinian authorities don't make a priority of stopping the illegal trade in antiquities.
It's not a priority, and I'm not suggesting it should be, because there are greater issues at stake here, but there just aren't enough people in either in Israel or in Palestine who are dedicated, from the police or the border patrol or the customs agency, dedicated to that. So.
Israel's ongoing construction of the separation wall has both uncovered new archaeological sites and led to increased Palestinian unemployment that has fueled illegal digging.
The impact of the wall on Palestinian cultural heritage has been devastating. The confiscation of some 10% of the land area of the West Bank, and naturally this area includes many major archaeological and historical sites.
The Israelis call the wall a security fence. The Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. The United Nations calls it a barrier. Whatever the name, Palestinians claim the construction of the wall has led to an explosion of looted cultural artifacts.
The wall is built in the West Bank, which is occupied area. It's not even built on the Green Line. It's built within or inside the West Bank, and all these sites, are supposedly Palestinian sites, and the Israelis have no right as an occupying authority to excavate in an occupied land like the West Bank. But they are doing that not on an individual basis, not on singular basis, not just one site, but they're discovering hundreds of sites, excavating them, looting the antiquities, what they call recovering them, and taking them to Israeli collections.
It remains unclear exactly how many artifacts have been removed from the Palestinian territories and where they are all stored.
Most of these artifacts are in the staff officer for archaeology storerooms. I would guess that no one really knows what they all are. There are probably hundreds of thousands of coins that have never been identified, never been looked at. They're just sitting around there and waiting for someone to study them.
But many artifacts find their way into the shop windows and store shelves of the marketplace, where they are sold to tourists who flock to the souks in places like Jerusalem's Old City.
The fact that there is more, shall we say, more prosaic artifacts and less high-end material, I think speaks more to consumer demand and the people who are collecting the material. And that's because it's mostly tourists who want to take home some sort of memorabilia from their trip to the Holy Land. There's always an available market, so there's always someone looting archaeological sites.
Archaeological issues were included in the negotiations that led to the Oslo Peace Accords, signed between Israelis and Palestinians in 1993. But almost 2 decades later, the vast majority of the historic treasures from the Palestinian territories remain under Israeli control. Archaeology has increasingly become a weapon used to promote political agendas. While some are conspiring to strip the land of its heritage for simple economic gain, for most Israelis and Palestinians, control of the relics and ruins of the past are a crucial element in the struggle for possession of the Holy Land.